Virginia in the late 1800s wore its Sundays like a clean shirt, and the Dorsey brothers fit the picture. Elijah and Nathaniel kept fences straight, barns swept, and hands generous at church fairs. They forgave small debts and brought strays back to porches without asking for thanks. When they married, the bell rang hard and bright, and people said the county would prosper because such men kept order. Their estate sat on a rise beyond the oaks. Inside, calm had rules. Elijah set the kitchen clock at dawn, the dairy bell struck on the hour, and every meal began only after Nathaniel's glance said begin. They believed in routine the way other men believed in prayer, and their brides learned this first. The second lesson came slower in closed curtains and soft steps. Death arrived soon after vows. At first it looked like fever. Then a fall no one heard. Then a wasting that made no sense because food was on the plate and the doctor said rest would bring strength. The doctor was old. He wrote what he was told. Funerals were small and efficient. The brothers stood with hats to their chests, paid the stonecutter, and returned shawls within the week. Still a pattern formed, the kind noticed only after a third echo. Clara first, Mary next, Margaret after that. Each a bride who arrived with a trunk and left the earth before roses from her bouquet had fully rotted. Neighbors told easy stories. Maybe the women had weak lungs. Maybe the water held bad minerals. Maybe God takes the gentle ones early. The brothers kept serving at harvest suppers, kept donating to the school roof, kept their smiles steady and mild. Elijah's was thin and exact. Nathaniel's lasted longer than it should. In the quiet between those smiles, other things lived. Some nights the house seemed to press inward as if the walls leaned closer to hear a heartbeat. The air learned to wait. Elijah counted steps, aligned cups to the table's grain, and logged the hour a face brightened or dimmed. He thought a life was lines that stayed straight if a hand was steady. Nathaniel watched eyes for flinches and believed beauty was most honest when it could not move. The town heard the dairy bell and took comfort. They did not hear the smaller bell, hidden, that rang only when the house wished it, marking when a bride might step outside and when a letter should be burned. Control felt like kindness to the brothers. If a bride trembled, Nathaniel named it new love. If she cried, Elijah fixed the cup at the saucer's center to show how still a thing could be. The world called this gentle. By the fourth funeral, the pastor's voice had thinned, and the cemetery keeper stopped asking which plot to chalk. Bread left the Dorsey kitchen at dawn for the poorhouse, but no one ate at their table without being told where to rest the fork. The brothers never argued in public, never drank to loudness, never forgot a name. People said they were born to steward the land, and the word felt warm enough to make them safe. Another family sent a daughter to wed on the rise. Her mother cried from pride and fear and could not tell which was which. The carriage climbed, the bell rang, and another white dress swept the steps. The bride smiled because all eyes were on her, and she was young, and hope is heavy when you carry it alone. She learned the steps of the house, the hours of the bell, and the length of a smile that means nothing and everything at once. She wrote a letter and watched it curl to ash at Elijah's nod. In town, the market talked of weather and hog prices and babies who slept through the night. The Dorsey name lay between those words like a thin blade under cloth. By spring, the new wife would grow pale without a clear cause. Another bell rang, the same hour as always, and the county rested because routine is the story it likes best. That story says good men keep order and order keeps death away. It does not say what happens when death lives inside the order or why Nathaniel's smile never reached his eyes when the bell fell quiet. That question waited at the edge of the next hour, where the face that smiled too long would come into its own. Elijah Dorsey lived like a metronome, every tick measured and every movement deliberate, and the town adored him for it. He was the kind of man who could calm a quarrel with a single phrase, who remembered the names of every farmer's child, and who seemed to step into a room without disturbing the air. His quietness was seen as virtue, as patience, as a steady hand in a county that valued predictability. Nathaniel was the opposite, quick with a laugh, quicker with a story, restless in a way that made him appear charming rather than dangerous. He leaned in when he spoke, eyes glinting with interest, and people felt special under that gaze, as if chosen for a brief moment. Together the brothers formed a balance, Elijah the pillar, Nathaniel the flame. But what no one spoke aloud was how both of those qualities bent into something darker once the door to their estate was closed. Elijah's order was not simple neatness. It was possession of silence itself. A wife's letters never left the house without passing through his hand. If she wrote with too much longing for her family, Elijah folded the page and dropped it into the fire, telling her gently that homesickness was a poison she must burn out. He pressed the ashes flat into the hearthstone with the back of the iron poker until nothing but a faint smear remained, as though erasing the fact of her words from existence. Nathaniel, meanwhile, tended to the things she loved most: rings, ribbons, journals, and one by one he removed them from her reach. He sold them quickly, almost gleefully, as if stripping away proof that the woman had ever belonged to anyone but them. In town, he joked that he had no use for trinkets, but behind the smile was a satisfaction that came only when a bride's last attachment had been severed. The rituals grew sharper with each passing marriage. Curtains were drawn tighter, meals eaten in silence, and brides became less visible to neighbors. At first, visitors might stop by, hoping to see the new mistress of the house. They would be received at the parlor door, Elijah offering calm explanations that she was unwell, resting, adjusting to her new life. Weeks turned into months, and the visitors thinned. Nathaniel smiled through it all, a smile that seemed too smooth, too long, like a mask that refused to crack. He lingered at market stalls and church pews, his charm intact. And while people praised his brightness, there was an unease in the way he looked at them, as though he was measuring how long before they too might fade away. The brothers' methods were not wild bursts of cruelty, but deliberate steps, carried out with the precision of men convinced of their own righteousness. When a bride grew too weak to rise, Elijah kept the physician at bay, insisting she needed rest and prayer rather than interference. Nathaniel cleaned out her belongings even before the body had grown cold, his restless energy needing closure faster than grief could bear it. Neighbors who might have asked questions silenced themselves, comforted by the Dorsey generosity at church and wary of accusing men whose reputations gleamed so brightly. The brothers wore normalcy like armor, and behind it, they built a private world where control was more sacred than love, where possession mattered more than breath. By the time each funeral came, the rituals were nearly perfected. A brief service, muted hymns, and the casket lowered before anyone dared to wonder aloud how quickly another young woman had been taken. Elijah bowed his head, composed and pious. Nathaniel smiled his too long smile, thanking mourners with a firmness that felt rehearsed. Within days, the room was emptied, the journals were burned, and another woman's memory was folded away as if she had never existed. For the town, the story ended at the grave. For the brothers, the story was only beginning. And though no one could name it yet, the air around the Dorsey estate carried the faint weight of expectation, as if the house itself knew another bride would come, and that her belongings too would be gone before her voice had faded. Clara was the first to climb the rise and take the Dorsey name, a young woman from a modest family who thought she had been chosen for a life of stability. She entered the estate with her hair pinned high, cheeks still flushed from the walk up the long drive, and hope pressed into every fold of her dress. In town, people whispered she had done well for herself, that Elijah Dorsey's calm presence and Nathaniel's laughter promised a household where she would never want. For a time, the illusion held. She was seen at church beside Elijah, her hand lightly resting on his sleeve, her smile small but intact. Then came the slow dimming, the closing of curtains, the absence from gatherings. Weeks passed before anyone saw her again, and when they did, it was only the casket carried to the cemetery on a cold morning, her name already carved into stone as though the end had been written from the start. The coffin was said to be lined with white lime, a practice Elijah justified as purification, a way to honor his bride by ensuring her body would return to the earth without corruption. The explanation sounded noble, even scientific to ears untrained in what lime could do. But whispers lingered, seated by those who had heard sounds the night she first fell ill, muffled cries that carried faintly across the orchard, swallowed by the heavy dark. Lime does not only purify, it consumes. It burns skin and blinds eyes, eating flesh until it is unrecognizable. Clara's death was recorded as sudden decline, a fever that took her swiftly. Yet those who prepared the ground spoke later of how strangely she had been folded within her coffin, knees drawn too close to chest, arms bent tight as if resisting the shape forced upon her. The detail was noted and then buried as surely as she had been. In the years that followed, rumors hardened into something colder. Forensic minds decades later speculated that Clara had not died when Elijah declared it, that she had been lowered into the box while still breathing, her voice muffled against the lid, her body writhing until the lime silenced her. It explained the unnatural folding, the twisted angles, the faint marks against the interior wood that no one dared speak of at the time. Her illness had not been fever but confinement, her cries mistaken for delirium by those who wanted to believe the Dorsey home was touched only by tragedy and not by design. What haunted the town most was how quickly her memory was erased. Within days of the burial, her dresses were gone, her jewelry sold, her letters vanished. Nathaniel, with that too long smile, returned to town markets as if nothing had happened, his hands busy with coins while Elijah maintained his serene composure. The brothers moved forward as though Clara had been a momentary shadow, not a woman who once laughed in the sunlight. Neighbors who might have asked questions swallowed their doubts, telling themselves that young wives sometimes died, that God's hand is mysterious, that misfortune does not always carry cause. To say otherwise would have meant admitting evil lived behind the very walls they admired. Yet the earth did not keep quiet. Farmers claimed their dogs howled when passing the cemetery at night, their bodies stiff, their ears turned to the fresh soil of Clara's grave. One old gravedigger told his grandson he had heard faint scratching when lowering the box, a sound he dismissed until years later when guilt made his voice shake. Others remembered the muffled sounds from that night of supposed illness, the strange stillness of the house afterward, as if the walls themselves were holding back breath. These fragments never formed an accusation, only a silence that pressed heavier with each new funeral that followed. Clara's fate set the pattern. Her burial became the script for every bride after, a ritual masked as devotion. The lime was called purity, the coffin called rest. But beneath it was a different truth, a house where innocence was consumed, where brides were folded into silence before the town dared to speak their names aloud. And though her grave grew grass and her name weathered on stone, the memory of that first bride lingered like smoke in the air, proof that misfortune was not chance but the beginning of something carefully, cruelly repeated. The Dorsey brothers smiled through it all, one steady, one too long, while the county prepared unknowingly for the next bell, the next bride, the next silence waiting to be filled. The Dorsey estate rose from the ridge like a fortress of gentility, its shutters freshly painted, its porches swept, its dining room lit each night by the steady glow of oil lamps. To a visitor's eye, it was a house of order and refinement, a place where everything seemed polished and controlled. Yet there was one detail, almost invisible at first, that struck those who paid attention. No glass reflected. Not in the hallways, not in the bedrooms, not in the polished dining space where the family should have gathered with pride. There were no mirrors, no panes of glass that showed back a face, not even in the washroom where one might expect a lady to smooth her hair. Guests who asked were met with Elijah's calm explanation that modesty was sacred, that a wife should not dwell upon vanity, and that reflective glass encouraged sinful pride. The answer was accepted with uneasy smiles. For many it sounded pious, almost noble, but to those who lived within the walls it was something else entirely. The brides who entered the house found their reflections erased. A woman could not check her bruised lip, could not see the hollows beneath her eyes, could not measure the shrinking of her frame as meals grew smaller. Each supper was conducted in silence, Nathaniel watching like a cat at the edge of the table, Elijah's steady presence forcing the air into stillness. Food was rationed with deliberate precision, placed on a plate not to nourish but to weaken, to prove control could remake the body as much as it remade the mind. Hunger crept in gradually, and without a mirror the brides could not see how it carved them thinner each day. They relied on the eyes of others to know themselves, and in the Dorsey house those eyes belonged only to men who found satisfaction in the erasure. Survivors whispered later that the absence of mirrors was not only about hiding bruises, but about removing identity itself. A woman could no longer anchor herself in her own image. She became a figure defined only by Elijah's calm gaze and Nathaniel's restless smile. The silence at the table grew into silence within her, until words felt dangerous and thoughts had nowhere to rest. Brides who once laughed at markets or sang in church pews became specters floating through the house with their heads bowed, careful not to disrupt the rules. Without reflection, their faces belonged to no one, not even themselves. The cruelty was deliberate. Elijah believed control was holiness, that by stripping away vanity and voice he was shaping purity. Nathaniel, more restless, enjoyed the spectacle, the way a woman would begin to glance at windows or polished pots, desperate for a glimpse of herself, only to find the glass dulled or replaced. He savored the confusion, the way she began to doubt her own form, unsure if the bruises she felt were visible, unsure if her smile had disappeared or if it still lingered in some forgotten curve of her mouth. Slowly the women stopped asking. They folded into the rhythm of silence, of meals eaten without a sound, of nights spent in rooms where only shadows gave back their shape. Neighbors who visited never saw the depth of this control. They remarked politely on the absence of mirrors, praised the house's simplicity, and left reassured by Elijah's steady words. But the walls of the estate remembered otherwise. They held the faint echoes of muffled crying, the sound of spoons clinking softly against untouched plates, the restless shuffle of Nathaniel's steps as he circled the dining table, smiling too long at women who no longer dared to raise their eyes. In time, the absence of mirrors became a story in itself, one carried by maids who fled the house in fear, by whispers that traveled along church pews. They said the Dorsey brothers did not wish their wives to see themselves wasting away, to know how thin their arms had grown, how deep the bruises ran across shoulders and ribs. Without reflection, the women could not bear witness to their own unraveling, and the cruelty of their suffering remained hidden until the grave. The house with no mirrors stood as a place where identity was dismantled piece by piece, until a bride became nothing but silence seated at a table, a shadow among steady rituals vanishing long before her coffin was ever lowered. and as each new bride crossed the threshold, another reflection disappeared. Another woman swallowed by the quiet, polished walls of a house that refused to give her image back. Margaret was Nathaniel's pride, chosen not only for her beauty but for the way her voice carried across the churchyard when she sang. She was lively, quick to laugh, and her words seemed to lift others in ways Nathaniel could never manage on his own. People said she softened him, that her presence made him less restless, less inclined to smile too long at other women. But within weeks of her marriage, her voice began to falter. At first it was a hoarseness, the kind that comes from a cold, then a rasp that no remedy could soothe. Soon she could barely whisper, her throat tightening each day as if something inside it resisted her attempts to speak. Elijah told neighbors she was delicate, prone to illness, and Nathaniel repeated the excuse with charm, smiling as though nothing was wrong. Yet those who listened closely remembered a sound that lingered when Margaret tried to breathe, a faint metallic rattle so soft it was almost imagined. She weakened quickly. At meals she struggled to swallow, her eyes watering, her chest rising and falling with painful effort. When she opened her mouth, what should have been words came out as thin gasps, and sometimes in the quietest moments there was that strange jingling, like a bell somewhere deep inside her. Servants who carried trays swore they heard it, though they never spoke of it until years later, when it was too late to matter. By the time Margaret collapsed, her throat had turned dark, the skin mottled in a way no physician could explain. Elijah recorded the death as sudden decline, while Nathaniel, still restless, handled the burial swiftly. Her belongings vanished within days, her hymnal sold, her ribbons gone. The house swallowed her memory as it had done with others before her. Only decades later did whispers surface about what truly happened in that house. Rumor said Nathaniel, obsessed with silencing the voice that outshone his own charm, forced Margaret to swallow tiny rusted sleigh bells. Each lodged deep in her throat, cutting the flesh, searing it with rust and infection. The faint jingling heard in her final days was not imagination, but the sound of metal shifting each time she gasped for air. The blackening of her throat was explained not by fever but by corroded iron gnawing her from within. To the outside world her silence looked like illness. To the brothers, it was ritual. Elijah with his obsession for control, Nathaniel with his hunger for spectacle. Together they had turned Margaret's own gift, her voice, into the instrument of her destruction. What made the story endure was not just the cruelty but the precision of it. Nathaniel had chosen bells, not coins, not stones. Bells that once carried joy, bells that marked Christmas sleighs and childhood games. The sound of innocence twisted into the sound of agony. Every breath Margaret drew was marked by that betrayal. Music transformed into suffering, festivity into slow death. It was not enough for her to die. She had to be unmade, her gift inverted, her life measured in rattling breaths that mocked what she had once been. When her grave was finally covered, neighbors remembered the silence at the funeral. Nathaniel stood with his familiar smile, thanking mourners with practiced ease, while Elijah recited scripture with calm authority. No one dared mention the strange sound they thought they heard in the coffin when it was lowered, a soft clink that might have been dirt against wood or might have been something else, shifting inside her even in death. The town turned away, telling themselves it was imagination, because to believe otherwise was to accept that the Dorsey house was not cursed by misfortune but driven by intention. Margaret's story joined the growing pattern, another wife gone, another silence explained away. Yet in the years that followed, children walking past the cemetery swore they heard faint jingling on the wind, a sound too delicate to be leaves, too steady to be chance. They said it was Margaret's breath still caught in her throat, a bell that refused to stop ringing. And though the town tried to bury the memory, the sound lingered, quiet but insistent, a reminder that every Dorsey bride carried her own private torment to the grave, each method crueler and more deliberate than the last. Elijah's obsession was not with words themselves, but with the spaces between them, with silence that could be bent and shaped like a substance. In the cellar beneath the Dorsey estate, he built a chamber hidden from guests, lined with thick wool and packed clay. The walls swallowed every sound, leaving nothing to echo back. To the outside world, it was just another room for storage, but in Elijah's journals, later found in fragments, it was described as a place for purification. He wrote of silence as though it were medicine, a cure for vanity, for rebellion, for the dangerous will of a woman who might speak too freely. He called it perfect quiet, and he sought to measure how long a bride could endure it before her mind bent under the weight of it. The experiments began with wax poured warm into the ears, sealing them until the world collapsed into a dim hum. Brides were told it was treatment for weakness, that silence would heal them from the fever or faintness Elijah claimed afflicted their bodies. They were spoon-fed thin broth, denied words, denied sound, left to exist in a chamber where nothing answered them back. Without hearing their own voice, without the comfort of footsteps or doors closing, the women began to unravel. At first they muttered to themselves, clinging to language as a rope. But slowly, words slipped into nonsense, syllables collapsing into broken fragments, until speech itself dissolved into whimpers and humming. The maid who carried laundry down to the cellar swore she once heard a bride muttering in a tone that was not her own voice, but the scattered sounds of a child. She said it was as if the woman had been pushed backward in her mind, returned to infancy by the weight of silence pressing in from every side. The maid told no one at the time, fearing dismissal or worse, but years later her confession spilled out, trembling, as if she still heard those faint mutters whenever she closed her eyes. Elijah's notes revealed no remorse, only curiosity. He charted days, hours, the stages of silence as it stripped language away. He marked when a woman stopped responding to her name, when her eyes grew vacant, when she no longer recognized her own hands. He wrote that silence hollows the vessel, that without sound the self becomes pliable, ready to be reshaped. To Elijah, this was not cruelty but order, a proof that control could reach beyond body into the very core of thought. Nathaniel never entered the chamber, but he lingered near its door, restless, amused by the muffled cries that never reached the air. He called it Elijah's sanctuary, laughing as though it were just another eccentricity of his older brother. When a bride finally disappeared from the estate, her absence was explained as sudden illness. The burial was swift, her belongings already gone. No one asked why she had not been seen in weeks, why her voice had not been heard in church or market. The town accepted the Dorsey explanation, as it always did, blind to the cellar where silence consumed her. The chamber remained, wool and clay pressed into walls that still smelled faintly of damp earth, holding within them the memory of voices stripped bare until nothing was left but the muttering of someone who had forgotten language itself. And when Elijah locked the door for the last time, stepping back into the ordered rhythm of the house, he carried with him the quiet satisfaction of a man who believed he had touched something eternal. Not love, not grief, but silence itself, shaped into obedience. Lydia came to the Dorsey house in spring, a bride with clear eyes and the kind of health that neighbors said would finally break the chain of tragedies that seemed to haunt the family. She moved with a sturdiness that promised endurance, her frame strong, her laugh unshaken. At first, people believed she might last, that Elijah's calmness and Nathaniel's easy charm would not wear her down as it had the others. But within weeks, Lydia began to change. Her skin, once smooth, showed raw patches as if scalded. Her movements became careful, and the smell that clung to her body and to the halls of the estate was sharp, metallic, like coins pressed to the tongue. It was not the scent of illness. It was the scent of something deliberate. Elijah had begun a new experiment, one not with silence but with fire that left no flame. He had crafted a tincture of copper dissolved in salt and vinegar, a liquid that burned slowly, invisibly, sinking into the skin like an unseen torch. Each night, Lydia's body was rubbed with the mixture under the guise of a healing treatment. She was told it would ward off fever, that it would preserve her health. Instead, it blistered her flesh, first in small red marks, then in great patches of rawness that spread across her arms, her chest, her back. The wounds wept, the air filled with the sour tang of copper, and yet her dress remained untouched. To anyone who might see her from afar, she appeared pale but intact. Only up close, beneath the veil of cloth, the truth lay seared into her skin. Her suffering stretched for weeks. Servants whispered that her cries at night sounded like the wail of someone set alight, though no smoke ever rose from her chambers. She begged for water, for cool cloth, but nothing soothed the burn. The tincture ate through her slowly, each day leaving her weaker, each day deepening the stench of metal that seemed to saturate the house. Nathaniel mocked the smell, laughing that his brother had turned the home into a smithy, while Elijah remained calm, insisting the treatment was necessary. In his journals later found, he wrote of fire as purity, of how the body could be refined like ore, the weak burned away until only what was strong remained. He did not see Lydia's blisters as wounds, but as proof that she was being remade. The town was told she had contracted a wasting fever, the sort that left the skin marked in strange ways. No one questioned it. When she was finally seen again, it was in her coffin, her face turned slightly so the worst of her injuries were hidden beneath powder and cloth. But those who prepared her body for burial whispered later that her skin bore the unmistakable marks of corrosion, not disease. Burns that had licked at her as if fire itself had touched her without ever scorching the fabric she wore. Her hands were twisted, her fingers curled inward as though she had clutched endlessly at air that could not cool her. The house did not forget. For months afterward, the metallic stench lingered in the floorboards and walls, as if copper had seeped into the very grain of the wood. Maids refused to enter her room at night, claiming the air was still hot, still heavy, as though some invisible flame remained. Nathaniel joked about it at market, smiling too long as he told neighbors the house had developed a taste for metal. The words unsettled those who heard them, but they said nothing, unwilling to confront what suspicion might demand. Lydia's grave joined the others. Another young woman gone before her life had truly begun, another bride whose death was explained away. Yet the memory of her remained sharper than most. People said that on certain evenings when the wind shifted across the estate, the scent of copper rose again, faint but undeniable, as though the ground itself was breathing out what had been forced into her body. And though no fire had touched her dress, her suffering burned long after, leaving a mark not only on her flesh but on the silence of the county itself, a silence too frightened to name what it knew. The orchard behind the Dorsey estate was the pride of the property. Rows of apple trees kept trimmed with a precision that mirrored Elijah's steady hand and Nathaniel's restless attention to appearance. Among those trees at the far edge where the ground sloped toward a stream, there had once been a dry well, an old stone shaft that no longer gave water but stood as a hollow mark in the soil. Farmhands remembered it, though they did not speak much of what they were asked to do one summer night. They recalled the sound first, muffled screams drifting from the house, sharp enough to carry across the fields though dulled by distance. By dawn, Elijah had them filling the old well, stone by stone, shovelful by shovelful of earth poured down into the shaft until it disappeared beneath the orchard floor. He told them it was unsafe, that the ground might give way and swallow livestock or workers. The men obeyed, but one swore he saw a faint white hand vanish beneath the first rush of soil before the others covered it. None of them spoke of it aloud again. Decades later, long after the brothers were gone and the estate had changed hands, storms tore through the orchard, uprooting trees and loosening the earth. The stones of the well shifted, crumbling inward, and what lay beneath was forced into light. Bones, brittle but unbroken, arranged not in collapse but upright, as though someone had placed them carefully rather than tossing them into a grave. Each skeleton sat as if forced to kneel, heads tilted back toward the sky, mouths open wide and packed with dirt that had hardened into clumps. Their teeth, impossibly preserved, still gleamed white within the soil-darkened skulls. It was not the disorder of hurried burial, but the chilling order of ritual. What struck investigators most was the marks carved into bone. Across each skull's forehead was a small cross, shallow but deliberate, cut with a steady hand. It was not decoration, it was inscription, as though Elijah had sought to claim them even in death, branding their remains with symbols that erased their names and identities. Scholars who later studied the discovery argued the crosses were not blessings but bindings, the final seal of a ritual that had begun with screams and ended with silence in the dark shaft of the earth. The orchard grew wild after the find. Workers refused to tend the rows near the ruined well, claiming the air was too heavy, the soil too soft beneath their boots. Children dared each other to stand near it at dusk, and some returned pale, insisting they had heard faint choking noises, as though the earth itself was trying to spit out voices swallowed long before. The county sealed the area, but the memory of what had been uncovered lingered, impossible to erase. Farmhands who were still alive in their old age admitted with shaking voices that they had known something was wrong that night when they filled the well. They remembered Elijah standing with his arms folded, Nathaniel smiling faintly in the half-light, urging them to work faster. They had told themselves it was just stone, just soil, that the faint sounds they thought they heard were only wind through the orchard. But the truth, unearthed decades later, proved otherwise. The burial in the well was not an accident of bad fortune, not mischief or rumor. It was method, ritual, the deliberate silencing of voices that had dared to scream. And as the bones stood upright in the earth, mouths forever clogged with soil, they bore witness to the kind of evil that prefers order over chaos, symbols over names, silence over truth. Another secret of the Dorsey house revealed itself at last, and with it the haunting certainty that the orchard's roots had been drinking from more than water all those years. After Nathaniel's death, when the estate was being stripped of its furniture and valuables for auction, a servant sorting through his belongings found something that should never have existed. Hidden beneath shirts folded with unnatural precision was a small leather-bound ledger, its surface cracked with age but still intact, the corners softened by years of use. At first glance, it appeared to be nothing more than a list, the kind any landowner might keep to record debts or accounts. But when the pages were opened, what lay inside was far from numbers or words. Each line bore the name of a woman, written carefully, one beneath the other. Clara, Mary, Margaret, Lydia. Others whose names had already begun to fade from the county's memory. Next to each was not an explanation or note, but a symbol. Bells, circles, crosses, flames. Nothing more. The simplicity was more chilling than detail could ever be. There were no justifications, no stories of illness or misfortune, no excuses offered to the page, just names tethered to marks as if each bride had been reduced to a single emblem, Her entire life summarized in a sign that represented the way she had been taken. The bells beside Margaret's name, a circle drawn over and over until the paper had thinned, perhaps for the bride lost in silence, her voice erased. A cross carved with such heavy pressure the ink bled through, tied to those buried in the orchard well. Flames sharp and jagged next to Lydia, who burned without fire. Each mark was not an afterthought, but a design, a completion of a ritual Elijah and Nathaniel had enacted together. Scholars who later studied the ledger argued it was not the ramblings of madness, but something colder. The repetition suggested intention, each method chosen and then refined, tested not once but again, perfected until the suffering became almost ceremonial. This was not cruelty done in impulse. It was cruelty recorded, catalogued, preserved as if for study. The ledger read not like a diary but like a blueprint of destruction, a guide to erasing a woman in body, in mind, and in memory. The discovery horrified those who saw it, yet even in horror there was silence. The auctioneers did not display the book. Instead, it passed quietly into the hands of county officials, locked in a drawer, spoken of only in whispers. The town had no wish to admit that the men it had trusted, admired, and relied upon for decades had kept such a record. The Dorsey name was still spoken in church ledgers, still attached to land deeds and charitable donations. To acknowledge the ledger meant unraveling all of that, admitting that every gift had been paid for with ritualized death. And so the truth lay hidden, sealed away in an office where dust covered it, even as its pages carried the proof of what the brothers had done. But memory does not rest so easily. Those who had glimpsed the symbols never forgot them. They described how the shapes felt burned into the page, how the sight of them lingered long after the book was closed. Some swore they dreamed of the marks, waking with the echo of bells or the smell of copper or the press of soil. The ledger seemed less like a record and more like a relic, as though the suffering it captured still clung to the leather, refusing to fade. What made it most unsettling was its incompleteness. The last pages contained faint sketches, half-finished symbols, as if the brothers had planned more, as if their methods were not exhausted but merely paused by death. It left the question of how many more brides had never been named, how many methods had been rehearsed in secret, never brought to completion. The ledger was the silent confession of the Dorsey brothers, and yet it spoke no words. Only signs that were enough to tell the truth. In those symbols lay the essence of their cruelty. Not chaos, not madness, but a design carried out with a steady hand and a smile too long. And the town, faced with proof, chose once again to look away. In 1904, long after both Elijah and Nathaniel had gone to their graves, a woman who had once served in their house lay dying in a poorhouse infirmary. She had been a young maid during the years when the brothers took their brides, and she had carried her silence like a burden for decades. But in those final days, with her body failing and the weight of secrets pressing down, she called for the parish priest and begged him to write down her words. What spilled out was not a memory of kindness or gratitude, but of nights so grotesque that even the priest's hand trembled as he recorded them. She spoke of the rituals the town had never seen, the practices hidden beneath silks and smiles. She said that Elijah bound his brides in ropes at night, not to restrain them from escape, but to mark them, weaving cords into patterns across their bare skin, pulling them so tight that blood rose to the surface. The ropes were left until their bodies were scored with lines raised and burning, imprints that did not fade when the knots were finally undone. The marks became scars, deliberate symbols that remained even when hidden beneath dresses and shawls. The maid described how Elijah called it binding their souls, a belief that the patterns cut into flesh were not only wounds but signatures, proof that the women no longer belonged to themselves. Nathaniel would stand by, restless and smiling, watching the process as though it were performance. Sometimes he traced the rope marks with his fingers afterward, admiring them like an artist admiring his work. The women wept in silence, unable to understand what was being done to them, and yet powerless to resist. Their cries were muffled by the thick walls of the house, unheard by neighbors who continued to praise the Dorsey brothers as models of virtue. The servant remembered one bride in particular, her back marked in a lattice of welts that formed a cross where the cords intersected. The wounds festered but were hidden beneath fabric, concealed from the public eye. She wore her Sunday dress with its high collar and long sleeves, her face pale, her body stiff with pain. To the congregation she looked fragile, saintly even. To Elijah she looked complete, her soul bound in the pattern he had chosen. The maid said she once caught the woman staring at her reflection in a pot lid, trying to trace the shapes on her own skin, mouthing words as if to name them. But Elijah had already forbidden mirrors. She was not meant to know what the patterns meant, only to carry them until her body failed. For years the maid held her silence, convinced no one would believe her, afraid of the power the brothers still wielded in death through reputation and name. But as she neared her own end, her voice grew desperate. She said the ropes were not simply tools of cruelty. They were symbols Elijah believed bound not just flesh, but spirit. He spoke of marriage as more than vows. To him it was ownership, eternal and unbreakable, enforced not by law or scripture, but by scars cut directly into the skin. He claimed once that when the body returned to earth, the soul would carry the patterns forward, branded forever, tied to him beyond the grave. Her confession reached the county, but by then it was too late. Elijah and Nathaniel were beyond justice. Their estate dismantled, their graves silent. The scars she described could never be shown. The women were long buried. Yet the image lingered, too vivid to dismiss. Young brides smiling at weddings, only to spend their nights wrapped in ropes, their skin carved into maps of belonging that no one else would ever see. The maid's last words shook as she said she could still hear the faint creak of rope tightening in the dark, could still see Elijah's calm face as he pulled the cords tighter, whispering about souls while Nathaniel smiled too long. She died before she could say more, leaving behind only the terrible certainty that every bride carried scars no one dared imagine, scars hidden in plain sight, carved beneath the silence of the county that had chosen not to see. Not every Dorsey bride was given the dignity of a grave. Some left no stone to mark their names, no coffin lowered into the earth for mourners to gather around. Instead, they simply vanished, spoken of as though they had slipped quietly from life, their absence explained away with vague talk of fevers or accidents. Yet the county always carried another story, one whispered by hunters who passed through the deep woods that bordered the estate. They told of strange places where the soil seemed freshly turned, where the ground felt softer beneath their boots than the surrounding forest floor. And more unsettling still, they spoke of trees with low branches where wedding rings and frayed ribbons dangled, tied in knots that swayed in the breeze. The hunters never lingered long in those clearings. They returned home shaken, muttering that no animal dared cross those patches of ground. For decades, these whispers remained unproven, little more than tales told over campfires. Parents dismissed them as superstition meant to frighten children away from wandering too far into the woods. But unease grew stronger with each retelling, for the patterns were too consistent. Shallow pits, disturbed earth, and the tokens of women who should have been resting in churchyard plots instead of swinging from branches like ornaments. The hunters knew what they had seen. They just could not prove it. Then, in the 1930s, storms tore through the region, flattening barns, lifting roofs, and uprooting ancient oaks. When the winds settled and the county ventured into the wreckage, the truth that had been buried for half a century came to light. In the woods near the old estate, where the largest oak had been torn from its roots, the earth split open. From beneath the tangled roots spilled what the storms had unearthed. Small bones, delicate and brittle, their shape unmistakably human though shrunken by time. Alongside them lay scraps of silk, faded but still faintly colored, the remnants of dresses once white or pale blue. The scraps clung to fragments of rib cage and shoulder blade as though the fabric had melted into the bones themselves. The discovery confirmed what the hunters had whispered all along, that not all the Dorsey brides had been buried with ceremony. Some had been discarded like offerings to the soil, their bodies hidden in shallow pits where storms alone could disturb them. The ribbons, once thought to be trinkets left by children, were revealed for what they were, tokens stripped from the brides and tied deliberately to branches above their hidden graves. Wedding rings dangled there too, dulled by years of weather, circling the wood like a grotesque collection. It was not accident nor chance. It was ritual, a scattering of lives concealed beneath the very trees the county had admired for their bloom each spring. Those who found the remains spoke little of it afterward, but the silence was heavy. The bones were gathered and laid together, unnamed and unclaimed, interred in a common grave in the town cemetery. The plaque placed above them carried no individual names, only the phrase, "the forgotten wives." Yet even in their collective rest, the truth of what had been done to them remained unresolved. For every ribbon and ring that had been tied to a branch, there had been a woman erased from memory, her body left without dignity, her story hidden in the roots of the orchard and the shadows of the forest. The storm had unearthed more than bones. It had pulled the mask from the Dorsey legacy, showing that the cruelty extended far beyond the walls of their estate. And though the county tried to move forward, planting new trees and smoothing the earth, the woods never lost their chill. Hunters swore the ground there still felt soft, as if more secrets waited just beneath the soil. And each spring, when ribbons fluttered from low branches, no one was certain whether they were left by children or tied long ago by hands that believed burial was not a duty but a ritual sacrifice. By 1912, the Dorsey estate was already a ruin of memory, its walls weathered, its name softened into silence. Elijah and Nathaniel were long gone, their graves tended but never visited, their wealth divided into parcels of land that strangers farmed. Yet the stories lingered, stitched into the county's marrow. Brides who vanished, funerals too swift, coffins too light, graves without names. For decades, the whispers had been dismissed as superstition, the kind of cruel gossip that attaches itself to a family when misfortune seems to repeat. But the unease never died, and it reached the ears of lawmakers who, while unwilling to say the brothers' names aloud, could no longer ignore the shadow they had left. That year, without fanfare or public speeches, the state passed a statute unlike any before it. It required that every woman who died within a year of marriage undergo official investigation, her body examined, her cause of death recorded not just by family physicians but by coroners appointed by the county. It was the first law of its kind, born in silence and sealed by signatures, designed to prevent deaths like those that had haunted the Dorsey house. On its surface, it appeared to be a measure of fairness, a protection against misdiagnosed fevers or suspicious accidents. But those who knew the stories understood what it really was. A thin veil meant to keep evil from hiding inside vows, a way of catching the next Dorsey before the soil could swallow another bride. The law was never publicly tied to the brothers, but historians later found the timing too sharp to ignore. The legislation emerged after years of hushed testimony, after servants' confessions and hunters' stories, after bones and ribbons surfaced where they never should have been. Politicians avoided names, But behind closed doors they admitted what everyone already feared, that the county had been complicit, that neighbors and pastors and physicians had looked away while women vanished. The law was not a proclamation of justice. It was an apology without words, an admission that silence had allowed cruelty to thrive. Even so, the change carried weight. Families who once hesitated to question now found authority on their side. A young bride's sudden death could no longer be explained away with vague talk of weak hearts or fainting spells. Physicians were forced to account for bruises, to write plainly when poison or neglect could not be denied. The act did not save the women already gone, but it set a boundary for those who would follow, one line in the sand that evil could not cross without notice. And in its quiet way, it acknowledged the truth the county had tried to bury, that marriage itself could be a coffin, that the most trusted men could conceal rituals of death beneath the veil of respectability. Still, the law carried with it a kind of unease. To write protection so specific was to admit that such horrors had already happened, that they had been close enough to inspire legislation. Old families bristled at the implication, insisting their wives had always been safe, their daughters well guarded. But others looked at the new statute and nodded with grim relief, knowing that protection written into law was the only way to counter the silence of neighbors too afraid to speak. Historians who traced the origins of the act wrote plainly what politicians of 1912 had not dared, that the Dorsey legacy was etched into its lines. Though their name was absent from records, their shadow darkened every clause. The law was the echo of their brides' voices, the final consequence of suffering too long ignored, and while the Dorsey brothers had lived and died without ever facing trial, their control over women's lives ended in the ink of that statute. What they had hidden in their cellar, their orchard, and their well was now written in the state's code, a reminder that silence births monsters and that even the most revered names can be unmasked by the dead they leave behind. The county moved on, at least outwardly, but each time a coroner bent over the body of a young wife in the years that followed, each time an investigation was opened because of her sudden death, the memory of the Dorsey brides lingered. The law was their memorial, though no stone bore their names. It was the first acknowledgement that evil could grow inside a home like theirs, unseen, smiling too long until the state itself was forced to look closer. By the 1950s, the Dorsey estate had fallen into disrepair, its shutters sagging, its porches collapsing under the weight of neglect. The land was sold, and what remained of the grand house was torn down piece by piece, its bricks carted off for reuse, its timbers burned or buried. To the eye it vanished, leaving only the orchard and the memory of what once stood at the top of the ridge. Yet demolition did not erase its shadow. Children walking past the old grounds swore they heard bells drifting through the trees, faint jingling that rose and fell with the wind. Some claimed the sound came from the branches themselves, as if invisible hands had tied ribbons and sleigh bells to the orchard's limbs long ago. Their echoes never cut loose. Adults dismissed it as imagination, but the children never forgot. They said it was the brides calling, their breath still rattling with metal, their voices swallowed but not gone. The county grew around the place, new houses rising where the orchard thinned. But the land itself carried unease. Hunters avoided it. Farmers plowed near but not through it. Each spring, when the trees blossomed white, people remarked on their beauty, but no one lingered after dusk. The past had rooted itself too deeply, impossible to tear free even after the house was reduced to rubble. For those who remembered the stories, the demolition felt hollow. Evil had not lived in the bricks or timbers. It had lived in the vows spoken at the altar, in the meals eaten at silent tables, in the rituals that turned ordinary objects into instruments of torment. The house was gone, but the truth remained. woven into the county's history like a scar that could not be hidden. The legacy of the Dorsey brothers was not one of madness and shadows, but of cruelty disguised as normal life. Weddings that should have been beginnings were endings. Smiles that should have meant joy became masks. Supper tables that should have echoed with conversation became stages for silence and control. What the world calls safety, the home, the vow, the family, was turned inside out, made into the very setting where destruction thrived. That was the horror of the Dorseys, not that they looked monstrous, but that they looked good. As the documentary closes, the question lingers like the faint chime of a bell carried on the wind. If cruelty can wear lace and vows, if evil can sit quietly at a supper table and pass bread with steady hands, how would we know it today? Would we see it in time? Or would we look away as the county once did, comforted by order, blinded by smiles that lasted too long? The house is gone, the orchard overgrown, but the lesson remains heavy and unresolved. Silence is where evil thrives. What do you think? Could this happen again?